Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 100 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, we're talking in detail about all kinds of things related to IFR minimums. Plus, this week in the news, some GPS receivers may have a problem starting in April, and we'll tell you why. And the final numbers are out for aircraft sales in 2018, and we'll tell you who came out on top. And finally, a young flight instructor in Australia did something unusual when he got bored. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you and have a little fun. If you're new to the show, I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and I specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20, SR22, and the SF50 Vision Jet. So if you're starting to think that you might be interested in buying one of these aircraft, or you'd like some training in one, please call me today for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Just pick up the phone, call 650-967-2500. And if you're listening to us for the first time, please touch the subscribe button on whatever app you're using so that our new shows will be downloaded for free to your smartphone each week. Last week in episode 99, we talked with Flying Magazine senior editor Rob Mark about how it was possible for an Air Force test pilot to crash and die while landing a Cirrus SR20. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, and Atlas Airlines Boeing 767 flying for Amazon Prime crashed just off the shore of Texas on Saturday, and all three crew members died, and their bodies have now all been recovered. The aircraft descended at about 6,000 feet per minute and repeatedly dove into Trinity Bay, just north of Galveston Bay on the Gulf Coast. The aircraft was on its way from Miami to George Bush International in Houston. Early reports said contact was lost with the aircraft when it was about 30 miles east of the airport. The crash scene was next to the shore, and most of the wreckage ended up in a marsh. The aircraft disintegrated, and the largest section was a 50-foot section of fuselage. Atlas Air, which was operating the Boeing 767 contracted to Amazon Air, has come under fire by some of its pilots claiming high workload and low pay. According to a report in Business Insider, quote, 13 pilots from the airlines that Amazon Air contracts with have told Business Insider that their pay and benefits are below industry standards. Captain Robert Kirshner, an Atlas pilot and executive council chairman of Teamsters Local 1224, said bluntly, quote, "It's a ticking time bomb. They don't recognize pilot fatigue. We're able to prove to them that this is a fatiguing schedule." Now, the FAA implemented new rules back in 2014 mandating 10-hour rest periods for pilots. However, at that time, an exception was carved out for cargo pilots as a concession to the freight industry, so they were kept under the old regulations which call for an 8-hour break between flights. The NTSB is on the scene, and the cockpit voice and flight data recorders have not yet been recovered. From flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer Magazine, general aviation, fixed-wing, and rotary aircraft across the board saw an increase in the number of deliveries in 2018, according to GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Globally, airplane shipments increased 4.7% to 2,443 units in 2018. Billings increased 1.5% from 20.2 to 20.6 billion. The fixed-wing sector saw a 5% increase in piston units to 1,139, and turboprop airplane shipments increased to 601 units. Cirrus's new jet, the Vision Jet SF50, was the top-selling jet with a total of 63 deliveries, up from 22 in 2017. Cirrus also has the best-selling piston in the world, with a turbocharged SR22 delivering at 180 units. The normally aspirated SR22 is second with 135. In third place was Cessna's 172S Skyhawk with 129 deliveries. Worldwide, rotorcraft shipments rose 5.4% from 926 to 976 units. And, of course, Robinson Helicopters took the top spot, delivering a total of 316 aircraft in 2018. According to CEO Pete Bunce of Gamma, he said, quote, "This is the first year since 2013 that we've seen all segments up in deliveries." He said it's also the second consecutive year in which shipments of pistons and turbine rotorcraft are up, driven by the introduction of new models to the market. And also from flyer.co.uk, Garmin and Avidyne addressed the GPS Week rollover. Now, I don't know if you've heard of GPS Week rollover. I hadn't, but it's approaching. And that's the moment when, without notice, some GPS receivers will need a firmware update to address issues induced by running out of weeks to count. Now, the problem stems from GPS establishing the date by counting the weeks forward from week 0. However, it only counts for 1,024 weeks, so every 19.7 years, the count starts over from zero. There is potential for a receiver to think it's living in the past if it wasn't designed to account for the rollover. So April 6, 2019 will be the second time GPS week has rolled over, the first time being back in August of 1999. Of course, that was 19.7 years after the start of GPS time on January 6, 1980. Going forward, a modern GPS signal that is slowly moving toward implementation will have over 150 years worth of weeks before the weeks rollover occur. Garmin has stated that testing has indicated no issues with its devices. Avidyne's IFD series GPS navigator is affected, requiring a firmware update. Without the update, the Avidyne units will indicate the databases as expired on startup, and for those using Datalink Weather, any timestamped weather products will not be displayed. The communications and the VHF navigation portions of the receivers will be unaffected, even with the receiver thinking that the database is expired. Avidyne has released a patch to address the issues, and it's available from dealers. From avweb.com, financial relief is on the way for airport businesses affected by presidential TFRs near the president's two favorite vacation getaways. AOPA reports that tucked into the appropriations bill signed to avert another government shutdown was $3.5 million earmarked for New Jersey's Solberg and Somerset airports and Florida's Palm Beach County Airport, also known as Lantana, to make up for disruptions caused by his stays at the Bedminster, New Jersey golf course and Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Operators at those airports reported a loss of almost $1 million in lost revenue in 2017 because of the TFRs, according to AOPA. From GeneralAviationNews.com, BRS Aerospace has developed a whole aircraft parachute system for Van's RV-10 home-built aircraft. The company is now accepting orders for the system priced at $25,999. The BRS ballistic-powered parachute system can be retrofitted onto flying aircraft or incorporated during the home building process, according to officials. BRS Aerospace also offers the installation in 2 stages for builders who want to incorporate parts of the installation during the build process. The RV-10 parachute rescue system is similar to the certified retrofit system available on Cessna 172 and 182 aircraft and the one that's installed in all Cirrus piston-powered aircraft, except that an aircraft builder or mechanic is permitted to perform the installation rather than an A&P. The installation should take 48 hours to complete or up to 78 hours if the aircraft is equipped with an air conditioning system, according to the company. BRS Aerospace estimates that more than 800 aircraft are eligible for the company's RV-10 whole aircraft parachute system. The system fits into the rear luggage compartment with the activation handle located in the center console. BRS has delivered more than 30,000 systems to aircraft, ranging from light sport to certified aircraft. BRS has documented a total of 399 lives saved when the BRS parachute systems are deployed. In international news from avweb.com, Canada has dropped its ban on pilots with pre-existing type 1 diabetes becoming commercial pilots. In 2001, the agency made pre-existing insulin-dependent type 1 diabetes a disqualifying condition for the commercial medical, even though it had previously allowed pilots who had developed diabetes after obtaining their commercial license to continue flying. Private pilot Austin McDonald, who had type 1, and his commercial pilot father Ed McDonald have been lobbying Transport Canada to change the policy for several years. Quote, up until now, pilots who already had their commercial licenses when they became insulin dependent could apply for a medical certificate to keep flying, the elder McDonald said. But no one who was already on insulin could do the same. It really made no sense to us. And according to Dr. Peter Senior, chair of Diabetes Canada Professionals Section, quote, there was no medical justification for preventing people with diabetes from applying for a certificate needed to get their commercial pilot's license when hundreds of people who were already pilots when they developed diabetes continue to fly safely. From aeronews.net and several other sources, this story comes from the UK. You may recall that 11 people were killed when a Hawker Hunter went down on a highway during a performance at the 2015 Shoreham Air Show. Pilot Andrew Hill is on trial for allegedly causing those deaths due to gross negligence. However, Hill claims that he was suffering from cognitive impairment at the time of the accident. He was performing a maneuver called a bent loop when the plane went down. The UK newspaper The Metro reports that prosecutor Tom Clark QC described the way Hill was flying the airplane as extremely dangerous and that it was appalling flying, he said, and that he had not been cognitively impaired at the time of the accident. Hill took issue with the use of the word appalling, but did say his piloting was strange and anomalous at the time of the accident. At the trial, which resumed on January 14th and has been running now for more than 6 weeks, the jury was recently shown cockpit footage from the 1950s-era Hawker Hunter airplane. In the video, Hill can be seen to nod twice and slightly move his shoulders as if he were scanning the instruments and flying the airplane. The pilot testified that he had only 35 hours of experience in the plane and that he had practiced the maneuver at another airfield prior to the show and had completed a similar maneuver at Shoreham the previous year. From dailymail.co.uk, another story from the UK, a greedy pilot who left 3 passengers injured in a light aircraft crash after he grossly overloaded his airplane in pursuit of making £1,000 profit from the flight was found guilty by a jury. Robert Murgatroyd, 52, had been hired to fly 3 birdwatchers on an 800-mile round trip to the Scottish island of Barra on the Outer Hebrides, but his single-engine Piper Cherokee was 50% above its maximum capacity. The 1972 four-seat aircraft, which was overloaded by 29 stone, which I had to look up, that would be 406 pounds, due to the size of the men plus luggage and excess fuel, subsequently, quote, fell out of the sky as it tried in vain to clear a row of 300-foot-high pylons shortly after takeoff in bad weather from City Airport Eccles, Greater Manchester. The aircraft twice flew over the neighboring M62 motorway as it made a mid-air U-turn in an attempt to fly back to the airport, but it clipped a tree and crash-landed in a potato field 160 yards from the motorway. Police arrested and quizzed Murgatroyd about the 9 a.m. accident near the Manchester Ship Canal, but he claimed he was a hero for avoiding any deaths. Murgatroyd, who operated a commercial airline plus flying schools and clubs, told police, quote, "Without blowing my trumpet, if it hadn't been for me on that flight that day, you'd been collecting 4 dead people out of that field." But prosecutor Henry Blackshaw told a jury he grossly overloaded the plane so that it crashed shortly after takeoff, endangering the lives of those on board, and that it narrowly missed the M62 motorway on its descent into the field where it crashed. From thewashingtonpost.com, again, another story from the UK. With legal implications on potential insurance claims at stake, air accident investigators called into question the circumstances of the flight that crashed in the English Channel while taking soccer player Emiliano Salo to Cardiff, Wales. Britain's Air Accident Investigation Branch released its initial findings a month after the U.S.-registered single-engine aircraft crashed with Sala and pilot David Ibbotson on board. Sala's body was recovered from the wreckage 2 weeks later, but the pilot has not been found. Investigators said the pilot and plane were not licensed by authorities for commercial flights. There was no application to the FAA administration in the United States or to Britain's Civil Aviation Agency, quote, to operate the aircraft for commercial reasons, the AAIB said. The CAA has the power to investigate and prosecute any breaches of aviation safety rules. The Piper Malibu PA 46310P has yet to be covered from the seabed. Quote, "It is thought that the pilot's license and logbook were lost with the aircraft, and so the ratings on his licenses and their validity and the extent of his recent flying have not yet been determined, according to the AAIB. And finally, here's a fun story. This comes from aeronews.net. It's about an Australian pilot who kind of got bored. He was out doing a 2-hour test flight in an airplane that was being prepared for sale, and apparently it was not the most exciting flight he'd ever conducted. FlightAware.com captured his track that was reportedly dozens of kilometers long, which spelled out, "I'm bored," right there in the sky. It was not noticeable by anyone on the ground, but was clear from the recorded track. The flight was conducted in a single-engine airplane over Adelaide in South Australia at a constant speed between 9 a.m. and about noon local time. He's only been identified as a young pilot by local media and the company for which he works, according to Adelaide Now. The director of flight training Adelaide said it's not likely he'll be disciplined for the flight. Quote, "Apparently he got bored," said Pine Pinair, saying, "Young instructors, what can you do?" Yeah, right. What can you do? Hope that makes you smile too. I love that story. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll be on to our main topic, which is all about IFR minimums, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. We'll get to everything about IFR landing minimums in a few moments, but first a few quick updates. Now, we had an episode back in January, episode 94, with Master CFI Gary Reeves, who came in to talk about for-flight tips and tricks. And he talked about the various ways that he likes to file from one airport to another. And this got picked up by the Opposing Bases podcast. So if you're not familiar with that, it's two controllers out of the Triad Airport in Greensboro, North Carolina. They're up to episode 61. And in episode 61, they devoted about 25 minutes to replaying portions of our episode 94 and commenting on some of Gary's ideas in there. I'm not going to tell you all the details. You can go out to their show and find it at Opposing Bases. That section starts at about 21 minutes into the show, but a couple different things. They talked about Gary's comment about filing from a departure procedure, the last fix in the procedure, and then GPS direct to the first fix of an arrival procedure at your destination airport. And they said, at least in their place down at Triad, that would be easier for them actually if you were to be on Airways all the way, because they said the Airways actually comply with all the letters of agreement. So for them, it's actually a little bit more convenient if you are not flying at GPS direct, but if you're on the Airways. And let's see what else. They also talked about Gary's comment, which said if you're flying from airports without the departure procedures or arrivals, he said to file from the first VOR outside your departure airport and then file to the destination airport. And they said that would not work in their particular airspace in various directions because the location of the VOR and the location of the inbound traffic. So I think the big takeaway I took from that is that IFR procedures really vary quite a bit around the country. It's probably hard to generalize as to what's going to be the most efficient way to file. And here's an odd little story that happened over the last week or two at my home airport, something I could never have envisioned. I've been working with a Cirrus pilot who bought a used aircraft a few months ago, and he's been parking it in the transient parking area. And when we hopped out, we were in the end spot about 2 weeks ago. Haven't flown it since because of all the weather. Well, in the meantime, apparently the wind blew a porta-john up closer to the airplane, and the door kept opening and closing and banging the rear of the elevator of the Cirrus. And it did it to the point where it not only did it, knock the paint off in a couple different places, but it actually wore down into the composite sufficiently so the mechanic has said that, yep, you need to replace that elevator. So anyway, there's just always something out there. This is, like I said, one I could never have anticipated. And here's an update from my favorite maker of active noise reduction headsets for pilots, which is Lightspeed. They've released an update to their FlightLink app for the iPhone. Now, I wrote about that on my blog when it came out back in 2012, and I've always been a big fan of that app as it lets you record everything that you hear in your headset, including the comm radios and the conversation over the intercom. And of course, it's free, and it's compatible with all the Lightspeed headsets manufactured since 2012, including the Zulu 2, 3, Sierra Tango, and PFX. Though there is one little thing you need to do before you get started. You have to open up the battery cover and turn on switch number 6, which enables the FlightLink compatibility. Now, what I often do is I'll record a training flight and later give that audio to a student so they can play it back and go over what we did on the flight. And in the past, in order to transfer the audio, I needed to sync my iPhone on my home computer using iTunes and then find the right spot in iTunes where I can access the files in that app on the phone and then transfer the files over because they were too large to email. I would then have to use Dropbox or Google Drive to transfer the files to the students. And that whole process probably took about 10 minutes since I didn't do it often enough to remember exactly where in iTunes to find the list of files recorded by FlightLink. So I had suggested Lightspeed in the past that I'd much rather be able to use AirDrop so that in just a few seconds I could transfer the file to a student's phone at the end of a lesson. So I was delighted to get an email from Lightspeed telling me that they'd implemented my suggestion. So now you can not only edit the name of the file and share the audio file, any standard method that you'd want, including email, AirDrop, and so on. So anyway, you can find that app in the Apple App Store by searching for FlightLink, all one word, FlightLink. And of course, you do need a Lightspeed headset. And for a long time, I've had a list of recommended headsets on my website, and you can get to that page from the show notes because I always have a link in there. So just tap on the artwork of your podcast player, scroll through the notes, and you'll find a link to my recommended headset page. And I'll also put a link into the app as well. And if you haven't taken our latest listener survey, please do that. This time we're trying to figure out where people like you hang out on social media, or even if you do that at all. So tell us about what you do on Facebook, where you go there, or maybe you use Twitter or Instagram or Reddit. Just let us know how I can try and find out more people like you by posting on social media. So just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. It'll take you just a couple of minutes to fill that out, and that'll help us here on the show. Thanks so much. And I see this week the FAA has just posted a new video on YouTube called Mountain Flying at High Density Altitude in 57 Seconds. I'm not sure where the 57 seconds come from, but good video, a good little update on mountain flying and high density altitude. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I see that AOPA has an enhancement to their credit card that they offer. Years ago, they used to have a credit card that I used all the time because it would give me, I can't remember what it was, 3-4% off of all my flight training and fuel purchases and stuff like that. And when that feature went away, gosh, I stopped using the card. But it looks like they've now enhanced their card to provide similar kind of a function. So it says they've got 4% cash back on select AOPA purchases, 3% cash back for purchases at select AOPA partners, which they list, and 2% cash back for FBO purchases, including flight training and both aviation fuel and avgas. So that's pretty cool. So check that out. I'm sure there are all kinds of limitations and other details, which I have not gone through. So you'll need to do that to decide if it's a good deal for you. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And the thing I like about it is I'm sure that AOPA gets a small portion of your purchases. And of course, they can definitely use the funding. Years ago, they used to get tremendous amount of their income through the magazine, and the ads, of course, have dropped off over the years as people have moved more to online direct advertising rather than magazine advertising. So, this is a great way to help fund AOPA. And I heard from Jared Ward, who sent me a note about a half marathon going on at Edwards Air Force Base. It's rather unique, and I'm sure it was because he heard us talking in episode 97 with Mark Epner about the Leading Edge Club in Chicago, Milwaukee Airport, in which he talked about they participated in their run on the runway, which I had not heard of before. But apparently this is a thing at some airports. So this is going to be the 4th annual Edwards Air Force Base Run with History. Runners will have the opportunity to enjoy a half marathon. It's going to be mapped out on multiple of the runways at Edwards, including the world-famous Rogers Dry Lake Bed. And as you're going by various past, present, and future type of aircraft, runners will experience a one-of-a-kind culture and landscape of Edwards Air Force Base. So they're going to have a static display and historical markers along the route, as well as an exotic car show hosted by the Ferrari Club of America at the start and finish line. So all runners will receive a unique participation coin and a souvenir T-shirt, and this just sounds like one heck of a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that, I will put a link to this in the show notes. They say that they have a discounted pricing for registration prior to April 1st, and the event will be held on May the 18th. So sounds pretty cool. And let me tell you where I will be speaking the next couple of weeks. Let's see, on March the 12th, I will be down at the San Martin Airport near Gilroy at the Wings of History Museum, talking about the San Francisco Bay Tour that's been changed this past August. And so talking about how to go ahead and navigate that area. And I'll also have my Bay Tour maps available for sale there as well. And this is probably a good time to talk briefly about Patreon. That's a way that if you find value in this show and you're really enjoying it, hey, you can help support the show by sending us a few dollars a month. We have a basic entry level at about $4, which is, less than the cost of a Big Mac. And if you do that, you get some goodies. You can actually see my original show notes where you can see the full news stories. I only read probably about half of them, so you can read the rest of the stories there. And at the $8 a month level, you can also see the cut stories. So, for example, this week we've got 11 news stories, but 10 of them got cut. So at the $8 level, those people can read all the cut stories as well. And so I want to thank our new Patreon supporters, including Heath Bauman, who added his pledge to $4, Tim Sparks, Rob Miller, who's one of our new super supporters at $20 a month, David Shamlis, Mark Boddy, JJ Suarez, Jeremy Baylor, Sean Carbondale, Antoine Broussard, Mark Hill, who added his pledge to $20, Eric Fisher, and David Stroh. And you can find the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And I'd like to thank all of you who support the show in any way, whether you send me feedback or record listener questions or post reviews on iTunes and places like that. Thanks so much for your support. Now stick around. We'll be right back talking about IFR minimums right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Okay, let's talk about IFR landing minimums. Now, this is a great topic as a refresher for IFR pilots and maybe as a small peek behind the curtain for private pilots and even student pilots who are thinking about someday getting an instrument rating. Now, one thing we won't cover is the many, many different types of GPS minimums. We'll save that for another time, but we'll talk about just about everything else related to IFR landing minimums. Now, first, I want to thank listener Bob Luton, who wrote in and suggested this topic. I think this is the second topic in a row that we've had suggested by listeners, so if there's something you'd like to hear about, please send me an email. Now, Bob wrote, what do the regulations say as to when a pilot can leave the MDA or DA for landing? And he said he'd like to hear about the various minimum categories, A, B, C, D, etc., in the minimum section of the approach chart. He said, in other words, what governs whether an aircraft is operating in which category? So mostly we'll talk about the rules for Part 91 operations, personal flying, which are the rules under which most of our listeners fly. Yet I know that some of you fly Part 135 and Part 121 airlines, and we'll briefly allude to some of those differences, but there's a lot of complexity to those rules. And those of you who fly Part 135 charter or Part 121 probably already know more about those rules than I do. But if you are flying under Part 91, you can start an approach even if it's reported at 00. Of course, when you get to the missed approach point, you must have the required flight visibility to land. And if you don't, you must go around. Now, that being said, shooting an approach when it's below minimums is probably just going to burn gas and time. And if you do shoot an approach that's below minimums, after your first attempt, you probably want to divert to another airport with better weather. It just doesn't make sense to tire yourself out while flying the same approach multiple times over and over, hoping that things are going to change. An exception to that would be if the weather is above minimums, but you didn't fly the approach correctly the first time and were too high when you reached the missed approach point. In that case, you might reasonably attempt to fly the approach a second time. Or if the weather has been rapidly improving, you might choose to fly the approach a second time because you reasonably believe that the weather has improved sufficiently that you'll make it in the second time you fly the approach. Now, my understanding for Part 121 rules flown by the airlines is that if an airport is below weather minimums, you cannot start the approach. However, if you are past the final approach fix when the weather drops below minimums, then you may continue the approach. Let's look first at Bob's question about aircraft approach categories. If you look at the bottom of any instrument approach chart, you will see a table. And in that table, you'll see columns labeled A, B, C, D, and E. In each column, you'll find the minimums available for aircraft flying within those categories. Now, this comes from the FAA's Instrument Procedures Handbook. It says, aircraft approach category means a grouping of aircraft based on a reference landing speed, or VREF, if specified, or if no VREF is specified, then 1.3 VSO at maximum certified landing weight. Now, VSO, of course, is the stall speed or minimum flight speed in a landing configuration. And of course, you can find the stall speed for any aircraft, and it's POH or AFM. And here's a brief definition for VREF that comes from the March-April 2010 issue of FAA Safety Briefing magazine. It says the regulations define VREF as, quote, the speed of the airplane in a specified landing configuration at the point where it descends through the 50-foot height in the determination of the landing distance. And you may have heard pilots refer to this point in the landing approaches when the airplane is crossing the fence or over the numbers. This is typically the point at which power is reduced, perhaps all the way to idle, and a smooth transition begins from a descent to a level off, a flare, and finally a touchdown. Typically, we fly a final approach at some airspeed greater than VREF because in many light airplanes, VREF is just not a comfortable place to be. It's too slow, it feels mushy. The manufacturer's recommended final approach airspeed gives the pilot a generous cushion above the stall that allows for the bit of gentle maneuvering that is necessary to keep the airplane aligned with the runway centerline. So all of that came from FAA Safety Briefing magazine. Now, getting back to the aircraft approach category, VREF, VSO, and the maximum certified landing weight are values established for an aircraft by the certification authority of the country of registry. So here in the U.S., that would be the FAA. A pilot must use the minimum corresponding to the category determined during certification, or they can use a higher category. If it is necessary to operate at a speed in excess of the upper limit of the speed range for an aircraft's category, the minimums for the higher category must be used. So let's give you an example. For example, a Category A aircraft that is operating at 130 knots on a straight-in approach must use the Category C minimums, but the opposite is not true. If an aircraft is certified for Category B, a pilot can't just fly the approach slowly and qualify for using the lower minimums that might be available in Category A. Now, some situations that might cause you to fly a faster approach speed and hence require you to use minimums from a higher category could include, for example, an emergency return to the airport at weights that are in excess of the maximum certificated landing weight, approaches that are made with inoperative flaps, which might require higher approach speed, or approaches made in icing conditions, which might then require a higher approach speed as well. Now, here are the limits for each of the categories, and you should note that the airspeeds listed are in indicated airspeed, or IAS. Category A are speeds less than 91 knots, so typically that might be a Cessna 172. A VSO for 172 is around 40 knots, so take 1.3 times. That puts you up around 60 knots, and often these airplanes will be flying at 90 knots when flying at instrument approach, so that just barely puts them inside Category A. Category B would be 90 knots up to 120 knots. So that would probably include a Cirrus SR20 or an SR22. Their VSO speed is around 60 knots, so 1.3 times that puts you up around 80 knots. But Cirrus says that we should fly these aircraft on the approach at 100 knots. So that's why we're in Category B, even though the aircraft would be certified in Category A. Category C is going to be from speeds from 121 knots up to 140 knots. Category D, speeds from 140 to 166 knots. Category E is going to be anything that's more than 166 knots. Now that we know what the categories are, let's look at the minimums that you would find in any given category. The minimum section has two numbers that are critical for understanding minimums. One is an altitude, and the other is related to visibility. Let's talk first about the altitude. There are two kinds of altitude minimums you'll find printed on any instrument chart. For non-precision approaches, such as a VOR approach, the altitude listed is called a MDA, or a minimum descent altitude, and it's just what it sounds like. You can't go below that altitude. It's the minimum altitude you're allowed to descend to until you see something on the ground, for example, the runway, that permits you to descend lower. And you'll see the letters MDA printed next to those kinds of minimums. Now, for precision approaches like an ILS, the altitude listed is a DA, or decision altitude, and the letters DA will be printed next to those minimums. It's the height at which you must decide whether you can see something on the ground, for example, the runway, and you decide to land, or execute a missed approach. And as you're making that decision, your aircraft will descend a little below the DA, and that is expected. Of course, you don't want to spend too long making your decision or have the aircraft go too far below the DA. Now, in addition to altitude minimums, we also have visibility minimums. For example, the minimums for a typical ILS are the altitude you'd be at when you're 200 feet above the ground and a half-mile visibility. By the way, that's statute miles, half statute mile visibility. Now, when I quiz pilots, many of them just look at one number, the minimum altitude, and they seem to ignore the required visibility number. But both are important, though in different ways. The altitude number is published in feet MSL, so in other words, that's the altitude that you're going to read when you look at your altimeter. That is, of course, assuming you set the barometer correctly, something that's really critical when you're flying instruments, so make sure you always do that correctly. Now, if the visibility is listed in statute miles or fractions of a mile, that's referred to as flight visibility, and it's determined by the pilot, and it's the distance that he or she can see looking forward straight ahead through the windshield. Or if the visibility is listed in hundreds of feet, then the runway is equipped with a transmissometer, and that's electronic equipment that directly measures the visibility and produces a number in hundreds of feet called the runway visual range, or RVR. An aircraft are not permitted to land if that measured RVR is below the visibility requirements specified in a particular approach chart minimums. Now, minimums, both the altitude and the visibility, apply regardless of whether you're flying a precision approach like an ILS or a non-precision approach like a VOR. They also apply whether you're being radar vectored to the approach or flying the approach with pilot navigation starting an initial approach fix. Minimums also apply regardless of whether you're landing straight in or circling to another runway. Minimums are also the same both day and night, unless sometimes different minimums are specified in the notes section for night. Now, for a non-precision approach, there are two separate set of minimums that might be published depending upon whether or not the approach has a step-down fix. Now, that's a fix that's between the final approach and the missed approach point. And depending upon the equipment that you have in your airplane, you might not be able to identify the step-down fix, in which case you must fly to the higher minimums. Now, if you do have a IFR certified GPS in the plane, you should be able to identify just about any step-down fix, and then you could use the lower set of minimums published. You might also have two separate sets of minimums when a second altimeter source is used in the procedure. For example, if the tower is closed at the airport and you can't get a local altimeter setting, you'll have higher minimums if you use the altimeter setting from a specified nearby airport that is still open and can give you their altimeter setting. Now, the minimum altitude numbers and the minimum visibility numbers are treated slightly differently. The best guidance I've seen comes out of a court case for a Part 135 charter operator, and I think the same guidance applies to flying Part 91 personal flying. It says in essence that the MDA, or minimum descent altitude, or the DA for a precision approach, is not a weather condition. In other words, it's not related to what the tower is reporting as a ceiling, since that measurement only applies directly above the tower, and the clouds may be higher or lower where the pilot is approaching the runway. Instead, the MDA or the DA is just the minimum altitude a pilot can descend to before the visibility minimum kicks in. So in FAR Part 91.175, and the title of that, by the way, is Takeoff and Landings under IFR, it says in that part that you cannot operate an aircraft below the authorized MDA or continue to approach below the authorized DA unless the flight visibility is not less than the visibility prescribed in the standard instrument approach being used. In other words, flight visibility, not the clouds being reported by the tower. Flight visibility is what governs your ability to continue below the minimum altitude and land. But to do that, there are a few other requirements. For example, to descend below the minimum altitude, your aircraft must be continuously in a position from which a descent to a landing on the intended runway can be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvers. In other words, you can't have the power off, descending at 1,000 feet per minute, or slipping to get down to the runway because somehow you ended up too high. That's considered an unstable approach, and if you're too high to descend at a normal descent rate, you're not supposed to descend and land. And in addition to that, if you're flying Part 121 or 135, the normal descent rate also has to allow the touchdown to occur within the touchdown zone of the runway of intended landing. Also, in addition to having the required flight visibility and being in a position from which you can land using a normal rate of descent, before you can drop below the MDA or continue along a glide slope, you must have one of 10 different items in sight. Otherwise, you can't descend and land. Now, the first item is the approach lights. Most ILSs here in the U.S. have approach lights, and that's that big, long string of lights that extend maybe 1,000 feet or more from the runway, and they lead you to the runway. Now, here's a little bit of a trivia. If you don't have approach lights at an airport, the minimum visibility you could have on an approach is 3/4 of a mile. But with approach lights, the minimum visibility can be as little as half a statute mile. And here's something important to know about the approach lights. When you have them in sight, you are allowed to descend, but no lower than 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation, which is essentially the elevation of the runway at the end where you're landing on it. And that's true regardless of what type of instrument approach you're flying to a runway with approach lights. So you go below that last 100 feet using just the approach lights as a reference, you must be able to see and distinctly identify the approach light's red terminating bar, which would be at the very end of the approach lights, or the red side row bars. Now, for any of these next 9 items, you can descend and land on the runway. And that would include the runway threshold, the threshold markings, the threshold lights, the runway end identifier lights. Now, those are known as the REIL, R-E-I-L. Those are those blinking strobe lights at the beginning of where you're allowed to touch down. Another item would be the visual glide slope indicator. So that could be either a VASI or a POPI. If you have that in sight, you can land. The touchdown zone or touchdown zone markings. Now, those markings start at about 500 feet down the runway, and they're marked every 500 feet, and there's a large aiming marker about 1,000 feet down the runway. The touchdown zone lights, the runway itself or runway markings, and the runway lights. So once you're at that minimum published altitude, if you have the required flight visibility, are in a continuous position to land at a normal descent rate, and you can see the approach lights, you can descend to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. And if you later see the red terminating bar or any of the other 9 items, you can then descend to land. Now, 91.175 goes on to tell us that if the minimums are reported in hundreds of feet RVR, but the RVR value is not being reported, maybe because the equipment isn't working, then you're allowed to use the table they provide to convert the RVR in hundreds of feet into fractions of a statute mile, which you can then use as flight visibility. So, for example, an RVR of 2,400 feet can be converted to half a statute mile. Now, landing minimums published on instrument approach charts are based on full operation of all the components and all the visual aids associated with that approach. And higher minimums are going to be required if some of those components are inoperative. For example, if the approach lighting system were inoperative, the visibility minimums for an ILS would need to be increased by 1/4 of a mile. And if more than one component is inoperative, each minimum is raised to the highest minimum required by any single component that is inoperative. And if the glide slope for an ILS is inoperative, minimums are published on the instrument chart as localizer minimums, and you can use those. To find out all about inoperative components, there's a table which is printed on the inside of the government approach charts, and you'll also find them somewhere on the JEP charts. It's called the Inoperative Components or Visual Aids Table. And it gives you a complete description of the effect of inoperative components on your approach minimums. By the way, you may have heard from a flight instructor that if the glide slope fails while flying an ILS, that you can continue the approach as a localizer approach. Well, that is true, but you might want to consider just going MIST to sort out just what the problem is, because maybe it's just the transmitter on the ground for the glide slope that's out of service. But what if that's not the problem and there's some other problem going on with your avionics? That problem might go beyond just the glide slope not working. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't continue the approach as a localizer approach, just that you should consider whether you really know the full extent of the problem that's causing you not to receive the glide slope. Now let's talk about circling minimums. Circling minimums are typically used when flying an instrument approach to one runway and then landing on a different runway. You might have to do that if, for example, the winds favor one runway, but there's no instrument approach to that runway. Or maybe the instrument approach to that runway has very high minimums that won't let you get down below the clouds. Or perhaps you wanted to save some time by flying an instrument approach that starts in the direction that you're arriving from so that you don't have to fly maybe 10 or 15 miles past your destination just to start an approach that brings you back to the runway that's aligned with the wind. Now, you should know that circling at night in weather is particularly dangerous, and I have a personal minimum, which is that I won't fly a circling approach in weather at night. In fact, I would rather land at night with a tailwind, provided there's a sufficiently long runway, than to circle around the airport to another runway at night. Now, the reason is that when you circle, you're usually much lower to the ground than the normal traffic pattern altitude, which is already going to be more challenging. Also, when circling, you must keep the runway continuously in sight as you maneuver and circle around to the landing runway. But it's hard to see where the clouds are at night, so it would be easy during the circle to have clouds come between you and the runway, or for you to accidentally fly into a cloud. And then you'd have to fly the missed approach, which will be more difficult because you're no longer going to be aligned with the missed approach segment. So personally, I always avoid circling at night because the risks are higher, and so is the accident rate. Now, typically, the minimum altitude is higher when you're circling than it would be if you're landing straight in. So if you have to circle, make sure you're using the circling minimums and not the lower straight-in minimums. Common mistake I see is that when people fly a circle to land, they just look at the lower straight-in minimums and not the higher circling minimums. Now, the minimums for circling provide a minimum of 300 feet of obstacle clearance throughout the entire circling area. But just how big that circling area is has always depended upon the approach category that you're flying. So, for example, the category A, B, and C, and so on that we talked about earlier. But in recent years, circling areas were expanded. In addition to the category that you're flying in, the circling area is also now dependent upon the altitude that you're at when you're circling. Let's talk about the way it used to be, since that's a little simpler. If you were in category A, in which you'd be flying at 90 knots or less, your circling area would extend out to 1.3 nautical miles from every runway end at the airport. So if as you're circling, you stay within 1.3 miles of any end of the runway, you're safely staying inside the circling area at that altitude. In category B, the circling area extended to 1.5 miles from the end of every runway. And the reason you need more room to circle in category B is that you're flying faster, and so your turn radius is larger, and so you need more area to complete a turn. Now, I talked about this in episode 99. The turn radius increases by the square of your speed, so it grows rapidly as you get faster. And as the circling area gets larger, more and more tall obstacles get incorporated into the circling area. So circling minimums tend to increase as the category moves up from A through E, unless your airport happens to be surrounded for miles by just flat land with no obstacles. So in 2013, after listening to complaints for 20 years that circling areas weren't large enough to contain circling aircraft, the FAA changed the criteria for determining the circling area. The new table also increases the circling area for MDAs at higher altitudes to account for the greater true airspeeds and adverse wind gradients that are encountered at higher altitudes. Now, I'm not going to read the whole table, but I will tell you about the differences for MDA heights that are 1,000 MSL or less. Category A still stays the same, still 1.3 nautical miles from the end of a runway. Category B increased from 1.5 to 1.7 miles. Category C increased from 1.7 to 2.7 miles. That's a big jump, 1 mile more. Category D increased from 2.3 to 3.6 miles. And Category E stayed the same at 4.5 miles. And then as the MDA increases, we're going to see an additional widening of the protected airspace by about 1/10 of a nautical mile for every 2,000 feet that you go up in altitude. Now, not all instrument charts have been reevaluated with this new circling criteria. For those that have, you'll see an inverse C, the letter C, which would be a white C surrounded by a black background to identify circling minimums that are based on the new criteria. By the way, there's one other important type of minimums that you won't see on an instrument approach chart, and those are your personal minimums. I already told you about one of my personal minimums, which is that I won't circle at night. Another is that I won't take off from an airport unless the minimums are good enough for me to land back at that airport if I were to get into some type of emergency soon after takeoff. Now, an exception would be if shortly after takeoff, I'm going to be aligned so that I'm in position to land at another airport in front of me. For example, pilots departing the Reed-Hillview Airport in San Jose are given an initial small turn to the left that has them going toward the larger San Jose International Airport that's just 5 miles away. If I have an emergency after takeoff, I could then turn just a few more degrees to the left, join the ILS, and then I'd be on the ground much faster than if I tried to fly an approach back into Reed-Hillview. Another personal minimum you should consider is how high the clouds have to be at your destination before flying an approach there. For example, if you're a brand new instrument pilot, you might want to initially just fly approaches on your own when the clouds are maybe 800 feet above minimums. Later, as you get more experience, you might choose to reduce that number. Or you might use lower personal minimums, but raise them if you haven't flown an instrument approach in the last 30 days. But the whole idea is that you want to fly conservatively, especially if you're a new IFR pilot or if you're a rusty instrument pilot. Because, if you screw up and die, I'm sure at your funeral, lots of people will say, wow, he was a great pilot. And most of the time, when I've heard that said at a pilot's funeral, I know that was true. But any pilot can make a mistake. And one way to extend your longevity as a pilot is to fly conservatively. And that means adding margin to everything you do. So, for example, if you're flying close to a Class B, stay at least 500 feet below it, or at least half a mile away from it. And if you're flying your first ILS after you got your instrument rating, you might want the weather to be a little better than 200 feet and half a mile visibility. And that's it. Everything you need to know about IFR landing minimums. Coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's some feedback on episode 98, where I talked about things that you don't have to read back to ATC. And hey, Gerald says from Facebook, I was once on short final, clear to land, and the controller accidentally cleared another plane for takeoff on the same runway. All of a sudden, I see that plane enter the runway, and the pilot was yakking on the radio the entire time he rolled onto the runway about something unimportant, like how nice the weather was. Imagine my frustration trying to jump on the frequency to caution the conflict. He held the mic down the entire rollout. I executed a go-around before I could even get to speak. Once he shut up, I called that I was on short final and already cleared to land, informed the controller I was going around, and even requested a right 360 back to land. Then the pilot started yakking longhand again, apologizing he was sorry. He should have been looking for inbound traffic before entering the runway. The controller was a surly older guy and had been ornery with me in the past, so I took it as an opportunity to politely let him off the hook, which I would hope he would remember moving forward since it's my home base. But it was a perfect example of why it's important to keep your finger off the push-to-talk button as much as possible. Well, Gerald, thanks so much. That's a really great example of why it makes sense to keep our transmissions brief. And from John in Washington, same episode, he said, found it informative and enjoyable. He said you suggested that the FM capture effect would be preferable to the AM squeal. I've heard many people suggest that the capture effect of FM would work strongly against safety due to its insidious failure mode. When we hear that horrible squeal, everybody listening on frequency knows that somebody's transmission was lost. On the other hand, thanks to the capture effect, nobody listening can know whether lost simultaneous transmission occurred at all, since it's completely hidden. And John, I would respond to that. There are trade-offs in every technology, and there's certainly no one perfect solution. But I would say that at least with the FM, at least one of those two conversations would get through, and that would actually increase the bandwidth. That would get more transmissions through sooner, and anybody whose transmission wasn't heard could always repeat, which is what now two people have to do with AM as opposed to one person having to do. And John says, another point I was hoping you might address was the instruction, change to my frequency on 2535. This indicates that because you will be working with the same controller, there is no reason to confirm mode C altitude or the altitude assignment. So what's the proper way to check in? He said, with you is a bad form and offering the altitude is redundant, but you can't skip the check-in. He said, my practice is to change frequency before acknowledging the instruction and then just offer on the new frequency that November 345 is on and then name the frequency, and do that after the frequency change. This lets the controller know that you copied the right frequency and made the switch, all with a minimum of airtime. Would love to hear your take. Well, that's a great suggestion, John. I had never thought of that, but sounds like that might be an effective way to go. And a text message from Patreon supporter Troy Wisman. He said, I'm listening to episode 98. He said that ForeFlight's 3D airport view will work for a destination airport if you pack before departure. Well, thanks for that. Obviously, that's something we didn't do, and that's a really good idea. We were talking at that point about the new 3D airport view that you can get, and I think it's a fantastic feature, so check that out if you haven't already on ForeFlight. Here's an email from Edward in Ohio. He has just listened to episode 99, where we talked about the SR-22 Air Force pilot crash. He said the SOP concept, so standard operating procedures, was drilled into me during a transition training in Waukesha, Wisconsin. He said moving from, in all things, an air coupe to an RV-12 with a former T-38 instructor and MD-80 captain. In the VFR pattern, my instructor drilled me on the exact concept you discussed. Be in the same place, same airspeed, same power setting every time. At the numbers, I was always at idle to bleed off airspeed to best glide speed of 63 knots, 1 notch of flaps, then begin to turn to base, and at the key position, full flaps, holding 63 to 65 knots to landing assured over the numbers. It just plain works. And yes, you know what, Edward, that's the beauty of doing everything the same way, the same time, and doing it the right way. It just works. It really simplifies landings as well as everything else. This comes from Patreon supporter Michael Hill. He says, I wanted to thank you again for your excellent podcast. I'm also very pleased to report that I've just reinstated my flight instructor credentials after 30 years by getting my CFII. So congratulations on that. He says, who says old dogs can't learn a few new tricks? Thanks again for creating such a fine and useful podcast. And yes, Michael took the route that I had suggested to somebody else here on a recent episode, which was that if you have let your CFI expire, you might want to consider just getting a CFII, as that might be an easier thing to do, and you pick up a new rating in the process. And also a few minutes ago, I read on Facebook that another Patreon supporter, Jan Squallis in North Carolina, just completed her initial CFI. So lots of CFI listeners here. Congratulations to you both. And anybody else who's thinking about becoming a CFI, let me know. We could certainly use good, knowledgeable pilots as CFI. So this is a great time to get into that. Here's an email from Patrick in Utah, also about episode 99. He says, regarding spin training, my instructors showed me spins in both private and commercial training. Of course, that was back in the late 60s and 70s when that was common. Hand propping too. Now it seems some CFIs don't even like to do stalls. Go figure. Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, I was certainly shown a spin back in my training in the early 1970s. And that was probably a holdover from the days when it was required. And of course, the reason the FAA dropped the spin requirement from the private certificate was they figured that instructors demonstrating spins was killing more people than the training was saving. So that's why we don't do spins here in the U.S. Okay, let's go to listener questions.
My question is, I always hear a lot about the base the final turn. Base the final turn. Spin out, hit the ground. You don't have time to recover. So I'm almost getting afraid of that base the final turn because I keep hearing it mentioned. So my question is, are we talking about a stall there? And am I going to hear the stall horn to give me a warning? It's almost presented as, oh, you messed up, you're dead. So I just wanted to ask you that.
That was David, and I recorded his question at the AOPA Regional Fly-In in Carbondale last fall. And David, I think the answer to your question is that yes, sometimes it is that quick that, as you said, oops, you screwed up, you're dead. I think episode 99 absolutely demonstrates that. If you think about it, if anyone might have been able to get out of that stall spin that we talked about, it should have been an Air Force test pilot. Yet he wasn't able to recover before crashing, so it must have happened extremely fast, so fast that he wasn't able to recover. So yes, I think sometimes it happens so quickly a pilot can't recover before crashing into the ground. And depending upon how quickly you're decelerating, the stall might occur very rapidly and the stall horn might not give you sufficient warning. So I think it's important that if a landing is not working out, as in this case where the pilot was overshooting the final and then put an opposite rudder, instead of trying to force a landing to work out, you should just go around. And you should do that when you first realize that things aren't looking good. And now here's a question from Mark Body in California. He's one of our new Patreon supporters.
I do have a question for you today. It has to do with VFR flight plans, flight following, ATC communications, and Bravo airspace transitions. So the brief part of my story was about a month and a half ago, I took a flight that involved flying over top of LAX as Bravo airspace. And I filed a VFR flight plan. And I opened that plan and I used flight following to get down there. But I noticed that during the flight, as I was passed off to different air traffic controllers, they seemed to have no idea what my intentions were to transition the Bravo airspace, even though I had identified a couple of VORs and had indicated, and my plan was to use either the mini route or the special flight rules area. But my question is, I tied up some airtime by telling these controllers what my plan was, even though I'd already included that in my flight plan. And if I'm doing something wrong, there's something else I could do to communicate that to the controllers. I'd like for you to help me figure what that is and maybe learn something. Again, thanks for what you do. Much appreciated, and looking forward to hearing your answer.
Mark, I know this sounds a little odd, but controllers don't have access to VFR flight plans. They could certainly, if they wanted to, contact flight service and ask for your flight plan, but they would almost never have a reason to do that. VFR flight plans are used really only for search and rescue purposes, so under normal circumstances, the controllers never see them. Now, the way they do work is that if you don't close a flight plan, either because you forgot to or because you crashed, someone will come looking for you. So that's the only function a VFR flight plan serves. Now, by contrast, controllers work very closely with IFR flight plans, and they have access to all the detail a pilot includes in those. So, no, you didn't do anything wrong. The only way a VFR pilot can advise a controller of his planned route is to do what you did, which is to tell them over the radio. And yes, I know that takes time. Now, my guess is that you actually had to repeat your plan to each new controller as you change frequencies. And I think that controllers have only a very tiny scratch pad where they can input just a few letters about your flight. So that's why they're not really able to pass along information that you give to one controller to the next controller. Now, one thing you can do that might save some time is that when you check in on a new frequency, you can advise the next controller of the point that you're currently navigating to on your initial call-up, or you can tell them about some upcoming plan that you have where you're going to make a turn at a certain fix or something like that. Now, if you advise them when you first call up, I think that actually saves time versus them later having to ask you about it, which is going to create additional transmissions. So, Mark, I hope that helps, and thanks for your question. And here's an email from David in Delaware. He says, I really enjoy your Aviation News Talk podcast. It's my favorite. Thank you for putting it together and producing it every week. I was wondering, where did you get your ATP multi-engine seaplane rating? Well, David, thanks for your kind words about Aviation News Talk podcast. I got my ATP MES in a Grumman Widgeon. By the way, that was great fun. And that was an aircraft that was owned at the time by Chester Lawton at Spruce Creek, which is a air park northeast of Orlando. Now, I heard from someone recently that Chester has sold that airplane, and it's now owned by someone in the southeast. And I did a quick search on it, and I found a video of that airplane, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I did find that it's now at a company that's at waterwings.com. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And it's funny things you remember from training. I remember that the no-flap stall speed on that aircraft was 100 miles an hour, and yet the flap operating speed was 104. It was like, whoa, you want to get those flaps in promptly at 104. You don't want to get all the way down to 100 before lowering the flaps. So anyway, great airplane. Hope you get a chance to fly it. And if you are interested in buying any model of Cirrus aircraft or jet, or thinking about flight training, please contact me today for free consultations. In some cases, I can also arrange a free demo flight for you, and I'm happy to talk with you about the ins and outs of buying new versus used. Just give me a call, 650-967-2500. The call is free, or go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the website. And that's where you can also leave any listener questions that you have or pass along any feedback. As you know, I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. Also, please check out the Patreon site and think about maybe becoming a supporter of the show. Because if you find value in the show and if you're in a position to help, well, it's easy to just go ahead and donate a couple of dollars a month via credit card by going out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And finally, please take a moment to tell one of your aviation friends about how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, well, just send them out to the App Store and they can search for Aviation News Talk and download our free app, just like any other app that you download for an iPhone or Android. Just go to the App Store and look for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.